The wireless networks broadcast from your router function very similarly to walkie-talkies or those handheld radios that you've seen. All of these Wi-Fi networks operate on channels. So within a given frequency band, whether it be 2.4 gigahertz, 5 gigahertz, or even 6 gigahertz for Wi-Fi 6 routers, within those frequency bands, there are specific channels that your router communicates with your devices on. To take this analogy one step further, let's say your neighbor has a router that's broadcasting a wireless network. If that wireless network is being broadcast at the same channel as yours, you could experience some interference. Very similar to when you're on a walkie-talkie. If somebody's operating on the same channel as you or on a channel right next to yours, say you're operating on channel 1, somebody else is operating on channel 2, you'll be able to either hear their conversation or you'll hear some static from their communications. This same exact thing can happen with your wireless router and your wireless networks. If there are other wireless networks operating on the same channel or an adjacent channel, the communications between your devices and your router could be negatively impacted by that. So what do people do with their walkie-talkies when they either hear somebody else's conversation or they get static from somebody else's communications? Well, you change the channel and you try to find a channel that nobody else is using. Many people try to do the same thing with their router. If people think that their wireless networks are being impacted by their neighbors or nearby wireless networks that are operating on the same or a similar channel, they try to manually change the channels that their Wi-Fi networks are operating on in order to avoid this interference. This might seem logical, right? It makes sense. It's the same thing you do with your walkie-talkies. Well, today I'm here to actually argue against that action. In today's episode from Network from Home, I'm going to be explaining why I think you should leave your router settings alone when it comes to the Wi-Fi channels that it operates on. To help me explain my advice here, it's important that we quickly go over the two different ways that your wireless networks can be interfered with by other wireless networks operating on the same or similar channels. Let's cover the obvious one first. What if one of your neighbors has a wireless network that's operating on the exact same channel as a wireless network that's being broadcast from your router? In these situations, it's very similar to a deli counter at a grocery store. When there are multiple networks operating on the same channel, basically what happens is the devices take turns in terms of when they communicate with the router. All of the communication requests are put into a list, much like at the deli counter when you take a number, and they're processed in that order. So as you can imagine, just like if you're at the deli waiting to get your salami and your cold cuts, if there are a lot of communication requests in that queue, it can delay the processing of the communication between your devices and your router. The good news here is in many cases, this is the more tolerable interference. These devices, these routers, they can process communications so quickly that it would really take a lot of devices sending requests at the same time in order to really affect your communications. Now let's dive into the other type of interference. This other type of interference is if your neighbor or there's another wireless network that's operating on a wireless channel that is adjacent or overlapping with your Wi-Fi channel that you're operating on. As opposed to processing communications in order, like what happens when two wireless networks are operating on the same channel, if there are two networks on overlapping channels, they don't process their communications in order at all. In fact, it's very similar to two different people making two different phone calls in the same room. I don't know if you've ever had that happen to you, but what ends up happening is each person starts talking louder to drown out the other person in the room that's on the phone. And what happens is you kind of have this escalation where both of these people on the phone are trying to talk louder than the other, so that way their communications can be easily understood on the other end. This situation where two channels overlapping each other, this needs to be avoided at all costs just because it has a larger impact on the communications between your devices and your router. So let's keep this in mind here as I go about explaining myself on why you shouldn't be changing your router settings when it comes to Wi-Fi channels. Okay, the main reason why you shouldn't be manually changing the channel settings of your wireless networks is simply because by default, your router will do that for you. On the vast majority of routers, each time the router starts up, they do a scan. They look to see what channels nearby wireless networks are operating on, and also they want to make sure that they select a channel that's not overlapping with another wireless channel that another router is operating on. If you'll remember, I previously mentioned how overlapping channels are the biggest issue. Well, let me give you some information based upon the different frequencies of wireless networks. So when your router picks these Wi-Fi channels to operate on, this is a lot harder to do on the 2.4 gigahertz wireless network band, and that's because there are only really 3 main channels that don't overlap with each other that most routers choose from. That's channel 1, 6, and 11 in the 2.4 gigahertz wireless band. With the 5 and 6 gigahertz wireless bands, there are a lot more non-overlapping channels to choose from. For example, in the 5 gigahertz wireless network band, there are 24 non-overlapping channels. So there's really not much of a worry about having an overlapping channel or having a channel that will be impacted by your neighbor's networks. The same goes for Wi-Fi 6. Wi-Fi 6 has 60 individual non-overlapping channels, so you're really not going to have any problems with 5 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz wireless networks when it comes to the channels they select. Again, the only wireless frequency you really have to worry about when it comes to channel congestion is the 2.4 gigahertz wireless network. But even with 3 channels to choose from that are non-overlapping, 1, 6, and 11, you would still need quite a few nearby wireless networks that are operating on these channels before you experience any issues. But in a worst case scenario where you're experiencing delay or problems with devices operating on the 2.4 gigahertz wireless network, what you can do is you can just restart your router, and again, it will change the channel for you and automatically select one that has the least amount of interference. If you manually select the channel for the 2.4 gigahertz wireless network, on the other hand, what if you have a neighbor that moves in after the fact that starts using an adjacent channel or the same channel? Then you have to go into your router settings again and make changes each time you want to change the channel that the 2.4 gigahertz network is operating on. The other reason why you don't have to go in and make any changes to your router's Wi-Fi channel settings is just due to advancements in technology. When Wi-Fi first came out and everybody was operating on only a 2.4 gigahertz wireless network, there was obviously a lot more opportunity for congestion if you lived in an area such as an apartment complex or a dorm building where everybody had wireless networks in the same general area. But as I mentioned before, with the number of non-overlapping wireless networks in the 5 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz wireless network bands, you really shouldn't be experiencing that much interference to begin with. If you have a device that's connected to a 2.4 gigahertz wireless network and you're experiencing interference and poor performance, you have the option of just taking that device and connecting it to your 5 gigahertz wireless network. The 5 gigahertz wireless network, as I mentioned before, has 24 non-overlapping Wi-Fi channels, so you're never really going to run into problems with other people operating on the same or adjacent Wi-Fi channels on those higher frequency bands. So in summary, most of the things that you previously had to worry about in older networks, when there was only a 2.4 gigahertz wireless network band, you don't really have to worry about anymore. You should just let your router do the work. If you're having performance issues, just reboot your router. And then if you have devices connected to the 2.4 gigahertz wireless network and they're experiencing issues even after you reboot your router, go ahead and connect them to the 5 gigahertz wireless network, and that should solve all your problems. If you have any questions about this information that I detailed today, please drop a comment below. If you found this video useful, please give it a like. This will ensure that the video gets shared with a broader audience, and it really increases the likelihood that it helps additional people. Lastly, if you're enjoying the content that I'm delivering on this channel, please subscribe. I'm going to be continuing to drop more videos with helpful hints and tips with how to get the most out of your home network, and I'd love to have you along for the ride. As always, thanks for checking out this episode from Network from Home, and we'll catch you on the next one.